Hello, I'm Sumaya Ceylan, and you're watching Playback, Tier 2 World's weekly showcase of our best stories from around the globe. Coming up, the Black Sea grain agreement has been extended for another 120 days. It's a relief for the global food supply chain, but we'll look at what this means for Ukraine and how it's still looking for alternative export channels. As the G20 summit in Bali wraps up, we will examine many topics discussed by world leaders and how fighting thousands of kilometers away continued to loom large over the meeting. Thousands of people, including delegates from 35 countries, marched through one of Istanbul's most famous streets to mourn the victims of a deadly terror attack there. Keeping Ukraine's agricultural sector alive and the world's food supply secure has been one of the greatest challenges of the war. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has been a lifeline, providing safe passage for Ukrainian grain and oil. While Kyiv and Moscow agreed this week to extend the deal for another 4 months, Ukraine is exploring alternative routes for its exports.
Just days after the Black Sea Grain Initiative almost collapsed, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has announced the deal will be extended.
As a result of the four-way talks hosted by Turkey, the Black Sea Grain Corridor Agreement was extended for 120 days as of the 19th of November 2022, in line with the decision taken between Turkey, the United Nations, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. It's been clearly seen how important and beneficial this agreement is for the food supply and security of the world, with the delivery of more than 11 million tons of grain and foodstuffs to those in need, with nearly 500 ships in the last 4 months. I express my gratitude to the United Nations Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Russian President Mr. Vladimir Putin, and the Ukrainian President Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky for their willingness to extend the agreement, and I congratulate everyone who contributed.
Just over 2 weeks ago, Russia had threatened to pull out of the agreement after its vessels were attacked in the Black Sea. It held Ukraine responsible. But Turkish President Erdogan intervened and convinced the Russian leader Vladimir Putin to get the grain deal back on track. Moscow does still have reservations, and that is why it's only been extended for 4 months at this stage.
All issues related to the lifting of restrictions on the export of food and fertilizers of the Russian Federation must be resolved within 120 days. The Russian Federation has received UN assurances that the work on the export of its goods, including fertilizers, will be finalized.
Ankara says some of Russia's concerns are legitimate and has called on the international community to address them.
Extending the grain deal has been our agenda for a long while. Lifting the obstacles on Russian fertilizers and grain was also part of our negotiations. This was actually part of our Istanbul agreement as well. During this process, we continued our diplomatic efforts with the UN, US, and EU countries. Important steps were taken, and Russia has been satisfied. But I have to say that the obstacles have not been completely lifted yet.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appears to be on board.
I want to express my deep commitment and the commitment of the UN to do everything possible for the smooth implementation of this agreement in Istanbul by the Joint Coordination Center, and also to remove the remaining obstacles to the unimpeded exports of Russian food and fertilizers, essential to avoid a food crisis next year too.
Guterres says Turkey's role has been pivotal in preventing a global food crisis. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has also commended Turkey's role. The Turkish government says some Western countries are targeting Russia endlessly. Ankara says this is making de-escalation efforts more difficult. It wants Moscow's concerns to be addressed along with those of Kyiv, and that it says can be the only way towards peace. Hassan Abdullah, TRT World, Ankara.
Leaders from the world's largest economies gathered this week in Bali, Indonesia, to tackle the most urgent issues facing the international community. But as our diplomatic correspondent Andrew Hopkins reports, talks were dominated by the Ukraine conflict, and Turkey found itself once again trying to mediate.
It happened more than 11,000 kilometers away from Bali, But these images are what the G20 leaders woke up to in Indonesia. Police patrolling the scene of a missile strike in Poland, which has potentially threatened to escalate the conflict next door in Ukraine. A few hours later, the Turkish president was getting briefed by the German chancellor. Early indications that the missiles didn't come from Russia, he said, suggested a deterioration of the conflict wasn't inevitable.
Insisting that this missile is Russian-made can escalate the tensions. We are trying to get Russia and Ukraine around the same table. During these efforts, it's not acceptable to use provocative methods. Peace happens through dialogue. We want peace in the world by creating dialogue.
The Russian foreign minister was welcomed by the Indonesian president at the summit. But not all the other leaders wanted to meet him, leaving Turkey again acting as a mediator between Moscow and its opponents. One of the positive outcomes of that has been the grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, which was praised in the summit's final declaration. Food prices have come down since the agreement 4 months ago, but it's due to run out on Saturday, and there have been complaints by Russia about how it's implemented. The Turkish president believes it will be renewed.
Continuing this process is important for the whole world. We saw positive signals during the talks I had with Mr. Putin. Fertilizer and ammonia are important. We are working on this. As soon as I go back, we will also discuss fertilizer and ammonia exports with Mr. Putin. We will be working on also extending the deal to last a year.
The summit was also a chance to improve relations with other world leaders. A chat with the US president, talks over the sale of F-16 fighter jets still going well, says the Turkish leader. And a meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia as the two countries continue to patch up relations. The conflict in Ukraine has overshadowed many parts of this G20 summit in Indonesia. It's contributed to an energy crisis, adversely affected the global economy and threatened food supplies, all of which the G20 leaders have talked about, and all of which the Turkish government has found itself right in the middle of. Andrew Hopkins, TRT World, Bali.
Well, Poland's President Andrzej Duda says the missile strike that killed 2 people on Tuesday appears to have been an accident, not an intentional attack. His comments were echoed by the head of NATO, who believes the blast was likely caused by Ukraine's air defense systems in response to a Russian bombardment. And Jens Stoltenberg says Moscow bears the ultimate responsibility as it wages its illegal war against Ukraine.
Panic was the initial response to the news a missile had landed in Poland. Security was stepped up around the blast site as investigators tried to work out where the rocket had come from and who had fired it. Then came the announcement the incident was most likely an accident.
Yesterday, Russia attacked Ukraine. The Ukrainian air defense fired a lot of missiles to neutralize this Russian attack. It is unfortunately highly probable that one of the missiles fired by the Ukrainian air defences fell on our territory.
It's thought the rocket, which struck a Polish grain store just a few kilometres from the Ukrainian border, was a Soviet Union-era S-300, a weapon Ukraine does use for air defence. News it was likely not fired by Russia has de-escalated tension, but NATO says it does not clear Moscow of blame.
But let me be clear. This is not Ukraine's fault. Russia bears ultimate responsibility as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine.
Initially fearing the missile might represent an attack on a NATO country, G7 leaders, already gathered in Indonesia for the G20 summit, convened an emergency meeting. Russia has since accused the West of having an hysterical reaction.
Claims by various Ukrainian sources and international officials alleging that Russian missiles fell on the village are a deliberate provocation aimed at escalating the situation.
While much of the West heaved a collective sigh of relief, for those living in the village where the missile struck, it's been a reminder of how easily the Ukraine conflict could spill over the border.
I saw the smoke pile and heard the blast. When they told me 2 men were dead, I thought that could have been me. That could have been me.
I'm afraid. I didn't sleep all night, and now many ideas are running through my head.
NATO and Poland are now beefing up their air defences, and while this pinch point may not have resulted in an escalation, it's clear Russia's war could spread at any moment, either deliberately or by accident. Sarah Morris, TRT World.
Turkey is reeling from a terror attack on one of the busiest areas in its biggest city. 6 people were killed and dozens injured after a bomb went off on Istanbul's central Istiklal Street. A solidarity march for the victims has drawn hundreds of people, including representatives from 35 countries and religious minority leaders. Kübra Akkoç has more.
Walking together, side by side, remembering the victims of Sunday's terror attack. Local residents, visitors, government leaders and religious and community representatives gathered to express their solidarity.
I and my community condemn every kind of terror. We wish these terror attacks come to an end in both Turkey and the whole world, and that our God's peace and tranquility will be upon Turkey, the Middle East and the whole world. People should love each other because humankind is a family.
We stand in solidarity with everyone who has been affected by this attack. I express my condolences to the families of the dead and pray for those who have been injured to have a quick recovery.
I pray to God that there will be no more terrorism like this, that no child will be orphaned. The children pray for us from heaven. I wish for peace, unity and beauty. I hope these terror attacks will come to an end.
On Sunday afternoon, a large boom shook the neighborhood of Beyoğlu. Slowly, information emerged. A bomb had been detonated on the crowded shopping avenue, Istiklal. The main suspect is a Syrian national linked to the PKK terror group. Police have released CCTV footage showing the suspect's movements prior to the blast. She arrives on Istiklal Avenue at 15:17 local time. She is carrying a backpack and another bag. 12 minutes later, she is spotted outside a cafe. She sits down for 40 minutes, then drops her backpack and runs away towards nearby Taksim Square. That's when the bomb went off. Despite the trauma, Istiklal is bustling once again. At the site of the bombing, many paused to lay red carnations. There was one resounding message here on the Istiklal Street. Istiklal is ours. Religious leaders and representatives from the NGOs and the consulates in Istanbul united in solidarity, reiterating that they won't bow down to terrorism. Istiklal means independence, and the street is a symbol of resilience and strength for many Turks. Through that resilience and strength, peace is being restored here. But with the city still in shock, it remains an uneasy peace. Kübra Akkoç, TRT World, Istanbul.
How to feed the world without killing the planet has once again been at the center of discussions at the COP27 climate conference in Egypt. As we run out of arable land and battle soaring emissions, a family in the Netherlands is offering a solution to both problems. It has built a floating dairy farm in Rotterdam Harbor. Our correspondent Sarah Morris has been to visit, and she assures us the cows don't get seasick.
In Europe's largest port lies the unlikeliest of ventures. This is the world's first floating dairy farm. It's home to 38 cows who provide 800 litres of milk a day.
We produce milk, pasteurized milk, but also yogurt and buttermilk and butter, but also cheese. And we ripen our cheese downstairs in the basement under the water.
The cows live on the top level and have access to a field by walking down these ramps. Underneath them, the milk, cheese and yogurt are processed, and the bottom floor houses the flotation devices. It's all the brainchild of Minka's husband Peter, who was in New York City when Hurricane Sandy hit and noticed a fresh food shortage just 2 days after the storm.
Then he realized, why not making a floating farm which can keep on producing fresh, healthy food for the city during a storm or a hurricane, because it keeps on floating, so you can keep on producing fresh, healthy food.
The farm can also adapt to rising sea levels as the climate crisis worsens, but it's also a solution for countries who've run out of land for agriculture or who would otherwise have to chop down forests. It's powered by solar panels and a wind turbine. Rainwater is collected from the roof, and the manure produced by the cows is collected by this robot and later turned into garden fertiliser pellets.
And sustainability is also key when it comes to feeding time. This mix is made up with grain byproducts from Rotterdam's breweries, also grass clippings from the local sporting fields, and even fruit and vegetables that are rejected from supermarkets, like this Brussels sprout.
The produce is sold at an on-site shop and to Rotterdam's retailers, caterers and restaurants, meaning the city's residents have access to food with low transport emissions. Minka believes the concept is easily scalable and is already working on similar projects in Singapore, Dubai and New York.
Take a look, for example, to Singapore. It imports over 90% of all the food, and it's surrounded by water. So if you make floating farms around the city of Singapore, you can produce fresh, healthy food in front of the city.
Here in Rotterdam, plans to scale up are underway with a floating chicken farm and a port-based fruit and vegetable plot, both in the pipeline. Sarah Morris, TRT World, Rotterdam.
As the international community gathers to address the causes of the climate crisis, one of the focal points has been the impact of warming temperatures on our oceans. Studies predict mass extinctions of marine animals if greenhouse gas emissions continue on their current trajectory. Some species populations are already in drastic decline, with devastating consequences for local environments and economies. Our correspondent Edis Tianshan has spoken to marine ecology specialists in Los Angeles who explain what's at stake.
The fate of our oceans and marine life hangs in the balance as they absorb over 90% of the heat from global warming. But as the main source of oxygen for our planet, they can also be our ally in fighting climate change. Professor Sean Anderson is an award-winning ecologist who monitors various ecosystems across Southern California. Through his experiments, he's traced a number of species whose populations are in decline, and he says the climate crisis has been a significant factor.
In fact, most of the carbon we've emitted since the Industrial Revolution has gone into the oceans, and that's made the oceans more acidic. And so as a consequence, when these critters are trying to make their shells, sometimes they cannot make their shells. And so we're talking about catastrophic failures of oyster populations.
The changing temperatures and pH of the oceans is endangering thousands of species. Among the most threatened ecosystems are coral reefs.
Coral reefs, for example, under a 1.5 degree temperature increase, are expected to lose around 70 to 90% of their global extent. And if the global temperature increases by 2 degrees or more, there will almost be none left.
And that could have dire implications for millions of people around the world whose livelihoods rely on coral reefs as a source of food, ecotourism, and more.
Along the man-made climate change, other unsustainable human practices are also taking a toll on marine biodiversity. At least 14 million tons of plastic end up in our oceans every year, making up 80% of all marine debris, further threatening marine life and human health. Scientists underscore the importance of creating and maintaining more protected areas for marine conservation.
These areas are places we've set aside to have a lighter touch, a place where we don't harvest at all or don't harvest as much, a place where we don't drive vehicles at all or as much, and that is to give the rest of the planet some breathing space. So this allows the shrimp, this allows the birds to be able to reproduce, go about their lives and not be harassed.
Increasing protected areas can provide respite in the short term, but in the long term, systemic change, a shift to clean energy and reduction in our carbon footprint is the only thing that will give our oceans a fighting chance. It is Tianshan, TRT World, Los Angeles.
The UK is grappling with a soaring cost of living crisis, and food bank usage across the country is rising. More people are struggling to feed their families and heat their homes. Leip Oloronia spoke to charities who are struggling to meet the demand.
Millions of Britons are forced to make difficult choices every day about what to spend their money on. Over the last year, more than 2 million struggling households have turned to food banks for help as grocery bills continue to soar.
We help around 300 people each week, and that's in about 100 households roughly. So we give people 3 days emergency food, and then we will do that up to 5 times.
Now more than ever, charities like St Barnabas are finding it difficult to meet the increase in demand. Donations to food banks have dwindled whilst there has been a 25% rise in its usage. And for the first time in 40 years, everybody is feeling the pinch.
The problem is that we were getting people from wider than the London Borough of Barnet, and because of the cost of the food that we have to buy, we've had to now really limit it to people from the London Borough of Barnet, just to keep our numbers down.
It's the same story a few miles away at Barron's Court, originally set up to help the most needy, but has now had to open its doors to the masses.
As energy prices continue to rise, an increasing amount of warm banks are being rolled out across the UK. These types of community hotspots can be used by anyone to keep warm, instead of spending valuable amounts of money on heating their homes. And demand for this type of help is also on the rise.
The volume of people needing our support has risen dramatically. So that could be from needing a hot meal because they have no energy to cook at home. It could be wanting to access our shower service because they can't have hot water.
Barron's Court is preparing for a long winter ahead.
We're really concerned that as the cold weather comes, there will be a spike in levels of people needing support. We are going to open a second centre so that we can accommodate people who are living at home without any energy at all.
More than 8 million low-income households will receive a monthly cost of living payment from the UK government, leaving millions of other households without additional support. For many of those still needing help, charities say they don't see the demand stabilising anytime soon. Lape Alarinoye, TRT World, London.
One small step to the moon, one giant leap to Mars. That's the plan for NASA's next-generation rocket ship Artemis 1, which was launched on crewless voyage to the moon and back. It's an important phase in the U.S. Space Agency's long-term goal of getting people on the lunar surface by the end of the decade, and from there, potentially exploring deep space. Francis Collings has more.
6, 5, 4-stage engine start.
It's been a long and difficult few weeks for NASA.
Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1.
But the Artemis 1 Orion capsule is now in orbit. 10 weeks of problems ranging from engineering difficulties to back-to-back hurricanes saw it take 2 trips from the hangar to the launch pad and back. But for now, they're aiming for the stars.
Today, we got to witness the world's most powerful rocket take the Earth by its edges and shake the wicked out of it. And it was quite a sight. It's quite a sight. We're going to learn a lot more as we go. We've got 4 weeks of mission to go. We are just barely starting to scratch the surface of the Artemis program and gather data. We've learned a few things along the way, mostly that this system is performing exactly as we intended it to.
It's a major change in direction for NASA after decades focused on low Earth orbit with space shuttles and the International Space Station. If this mission succeeds, a crewed Artemis 2 flight could head around the moon as early as 2024. And if that goes smoothly, then once again NASA astronauts may be landing on the moon.
Now we're going back to the moon, not just for the sake of going to the moon, but to learn, to live, to develop, to learn how to live on the moon in order to prepare to send humans all the way to Mars.
No one has walked on the moon since Apollo 17, and that was 50 years ago. This mission will last 25 days and will travel 65,000 kilometers beyond the moon before looping back to Earth. Splashdown is expected on December 11th. Francis Collins, TRT World.
Well, that rounds up your week of news here on Playback. Stay tuned to TRT World for the latest stories.